Chapter 30, Part 2, JFK and Cold War Tensions. From the day that Kennedy took office, he gave foreign policy his top priority. He was critical of Eisenhower for holding down defense spending and giving the idea that the Soviet Union was moving ahead of the United States in the Cold War. And he took it upon himself to try to focus on foreign policy and dealing with the numerous issues around the world, whether it be in Berlin, Cuba, or even in Vietnam. Kennedy looked to move the United States away from the old Cold War philosophy of brinkmanship and massive retaliation that dominated the early Cold War era. Along with his Secretary of Defense, McNamara, Kennedy hoped to diversify the methods or ways in which the United States could respond to different situations around the world. This new flexible response would include increasing the number of nuclear weapons from 16 Atlas ICBMs to 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs. Also, he looked to create the new Green Berets, as well as add on 5 combat-ready Army divisions and 3 tactical air wings. Furthermore, Kennedy looked to increase the number of Polaris submarines from 2 to 32, which would then be able to carry 656 missiles. All of these increases in defense spending added a $6 billion jump in the defense budget in 1961 alone, but it also gave Kennedy the flexible response that he was looking for. In what would become one of the countries that Kennedy would have to deal with the most, also being one of the closest, the United States and the Cuban government led by Batista had fostered a relatively good relationship. However, that all changed in 1959 when Cuba had a revolt led by Fidel Castro, which overthrew the Batista regime. And as Castro looked to the United States for aid and didn't get it, he surprised and shocked the United States when he declared he was turning their government to a communist regime that would be aided by the Soviet Union. Now that sparked great fear in the United States, as we didn't want communism to spread, but looked to it have contained it throughout the Cold War, and now here it was just 90 miles off our Florida shores. And with this new alliance between Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, the United States didn't wait very long to take action. As part of a CIA plan to topple the Castro regime, 1,400 Cuban exiles stormed the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. Their hope was to encourage a massive revolt, an uprising of locals that would join their cause to attempt to overthrow the Castro regime. Even though these insurgents were trained by the United States military and kind of led by the CIA, there were no United States military personnel that stormed the shores. And pretty soon, the Bay of Pigs became one big fiasco where nothing went right and it failed miserably. It really brought kind of a dark cloud around the Kennedy regime, as people around the world kind of wondered what kind of young president would attempt to overthrow a government so close to their country. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Nikita Khrushchev didn't wait long to test the young president again. This time, the place was in Germany, specifically over West Berlin. Khrushchev wanted Allied troops out of West Berlin, and he thought he could intimidate Kennedy after the failed invasion of Cuba. Over 4,000 East Germans were fleeing East Germany to West Germany each day, and By August of 1961, Soviet tanks blocked a 25-mile border, and a few days later, they put up the wall. Almost apparently overnight, West Berlin was now separated. However, Kennedy flew there and made a speech about how we wouldn't let West Berlin fall, and we would do what we had to stand with our friends to oppose any foe. However, the Berlin Wall ended up standing from August of 1961 until its fall on November 9th, 1989, while George Bush was president. We turn our attention back to Cuba, and this time with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which for 13 days in October brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than ever before. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane, like this one pictured here, took pictures of missile sites that were nearing completion. Even though Khrushchev denied publicly that he was building these sites or was involved with anything like this at all, in reality, it turned out that about 24 medium-range and 18 intermediate-range missiles were being planned to be built in Cuba, which could strike the United States with very little warning. With missile sites being built and nearing completion, Kennedy and his advisors could waste no time. For once they were operational, missiles could be launched on a first-strike basis, threatening cities from Miami to New Orleans and even Washington, New York, and as far west as Denver and Salt Lake City. Kennedy and his advisors had several options. 1, an airstrike to take out the missiles. 2, to invade Cuba directly with an army. 3, to quarantine or put up some sort of naval blockade around Cuba to not let missiles or anything else pass through, just to name some of the options they were pondering. Not wanting to risk war or nuclear war to make it even worse, Kennedy and his advisors decided to quarantine Cuba and stop any Soviet vessels that would try to go by. Well, thankfully, the ships that were headed towards Cuba turned back, and as Secretary of State Dean Rusk says, we were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellows just blinked. Kennedy and Khrushchev, as leaders of the two superpowers of the world, had averted war and confrontation. However, tensions were still high, and yet, with the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, several agreements were made. A hotline was put in place from the Kremlin to D.C. so that leaders could contact each other in the future in case anything ever became so heated again. They also made an agreement. Khrushchev would pull the missiles out of Cuba in a guarantee from Kennedy that the United States would never try to invade Cuba again. And with pulling the Cuban missiles out, Kennedy had also agreed, as he was planning to anyways, to remove missiles from Turkey that Khrushchev had wanted taken out as well. Now turning our attention to Vietnam, as the French were losing hold of their colony, and as North Vietnamese and communism were infiltrating the South and trying to spread communism, Kennedy decided to, under his flexible response, send advisors over to South Vietnam to try to aid and train the South Vietnamese in their defense of communist aggressions. However, we'll take a look at this Vietnam War in more depth in class through numerous readings and discussions.